Have you ever heard of John Wycliffe? He's the fellow that translated this thing. In England, in the year 1400, this thing was written in Latin, from the Latin Vulgate. If you attended church at that time, all you would hear from the pulpit is Latin. It was so valuable that the pulpit Bible, the Latin Vulgate, was padlocked to the pulpit. John Wycliffe, he was an ordained Catholic priest, but he was also a professor at Oxford University in English. He grew up in the countryside in Yorkshire, in northeast England. Humble surrounding, humble parents. But he had a dream ever since he was a little boy. Do you know what his dream was? He wanted to have this book in Latin translated into English. And that became his dream. Well, he studied the ancient languages. He was fluent in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. With those three things as his text, he set out to translate that Latin Vulgate into the English language. And it happened. The year was 1384. The Wycliffe Bible was published both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But it wasn't without its opposition. Wycliffe's life during the time of his translation was constantly in threat. His work of translation to do the Latin to the English was opposed by all the leaders in the church. Do you know why? God's word, told in the language of the people, was a threat to the priests and the Pope. They might even lose their job. There could be a revolt against the whole church and the papacy. And the church could lose control because Latin was their power and Latin was their hiding place because the man in the pew didn't understand it. Wycliffe was a very brilliant scholar and a professor, but his task was monumental. He didn't want any mistakes. He used to labor for hours over one word to make sure that it was correct in his Bible translation. When he finished his book, and it was all finished, on the very last page of his Bible, he did the strangest thing. He wrote something that's very familiar to you. Let me tell you what he wrote at the tail end of his translation. He said, "The Bible is now translated, and it shall make possible a government of the people, by the people, and for the people." You've heard those words before. Do you know where you heard them? Hundreds of years following his translation, the founding fathers of the United States, they wrote a constitution. And they also put it in their Declaration of Independence. Those very words. A government for the people, by the people, and for the people. President Lincoln, 100 years after they had written the Declaration, he repeated those same words in a speech at a cemetery in the rain in Pennsylvania at a place called Gettysburg. And in it, he repeated the same words. A government for the people, by the people. Shortly after Wycliffe had finished his English translation, he died in the pulpit one day in a church in Britain, preaching his last sermon. But what a legacy he left in his death. God's holy word in the language of his people, in the seats where they could go and worship him on Sunday morning. King David wanted to leave something for his people, but God told him he couldn't do it. David's rule in Israel is just coming to a close. He has reigned for 40 years. Never in the nation's history has it been governed by such order and such clarity. And it wouldn't surprise me if Wycliffe, when he was translating the life of David, way back there in the Old Testament, in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it wouldn't surprise me when he was reading that suddenly it came to him, David had a government of these Jewish people, and it was a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. No doubt, that's probably where these words came from. Now comes my lesson. David wanted to leave something better than good government. He wanted to build a temple for Jehovah, where the Ark of the Covenant had a permanent setting, where the high priest could reside, and where those annual memorials, the festivals, would never be forgotten. God would give him the design, he would gather the materials, and the work would be completed before he closed his eyes in death. However, David was not allowed to construct it. There on Mount Zion, where the temple was to be built, David had everything in place. He had gathered the store of the stones, the cedar from Lebanon, the iron from the blast furnace, the bronze of brass from the lands far away, gold and silver from the king's treasury, blueprints set out by the king's architects, even the water buckets, I suppose, and the vessels for the thirsty workmen. They were all there. In David's heart, he wanted to see the construction, and he would be able to close his reign with a parting triumph. He could boast the most successful royal career in the annals of history, but it wasn't to be. In 1 Chronicles 28, verse 3, but God said to David, "You shall not build a house for my name, because you're a man of war, and you have shed blood." David is now going to conclude his life. He's ruled for 40 years. I'm going to conclude this series on David with these 3 words as my outline: yesterday, today, and forever. Let's begin with yesterday. David is going to address his people for the last time, and he's going to remind them of their yesterdays. Here's the text. 1 Chronicles 28, verse 1. Now David assembled at Jerusalem all the officials of Israel, the princes of the tribes, the commanders of the divisions that served the king, and the commanders of the hundreds and the overseers of all the property and all the livestock belonging to the king. And with these officials and the mighty men, even all the valiant men began to listen. Hundreds had gathered. David looked into the faces of all represented. He saw his yesterdays. He's an old man now, and he's surrounded by his beloved children of Israel. And he's going to give them some parting words. No doubt his voice quivered as he raised his hands to silence the crowd. 1 Chronicles 28, verse 2. Listen to me, my brethren, my people. I had intended to build a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord and for a footstool for our God. But I made preparations to build it. God said to me, "No, you shall not build a house for my name." Esther Kim was a young sportsman, and she was intoxicated with a dream in her sport, and it was Taekwondo. She had trained 13 years for that moment. She would be chosen to represent the United States in the 2000 Olympics in Australia. Ever since she was 8 years old, She spent every hour after homework training for this moment. It was in her practices that she met her best friend. Her name was Kay Poe. The two worked together, and they worked so hard for so long, it really wasn't a surprise that they would face each other at the Olympic trials in Colorado Springs. However, only one could be chosen to represent the country. They each won their divisions. All the other contestants had been eliminated. Now they faced each other. The two best friends now became foes. One would be chosen, and the other would be left behind. They had never faced each other before. Now both of them on the same mat, and only one could win. Only one could go to Australia representing the U.S. in Taekwondo. Before the event, Esther Kim faced something that was heart-rending. Her best friend, Kay Poe, had injured her leg in the match prior to theirs. And Kay could hardly walk, much less compete. Because of the injury, Esther knew that she could defeat her friend with little or no effort. But she also knew that Kay was a better fighter. And if she took advantage of her crippled friend, then the better athlete would stay home. What would she do? The referee called the two contestants to the center of the Taekwondo mat. Both were introduced to the crowd. Esther Kim then stepped back to the edge of the rim, and she paused. Then she bowed to her friend and opponent. Both she and the crowd knew the meaning of that gesture. Esther Kim forfeited her place on the Taekwondo team because she considered the cause more important than the credit. David's yesterday as a king was more important than building a house for God. That was his yesterday. Now let's talk about David's today. David's on the platform and he's facing a large assembly of Jewish people. He turns and with emotion in his throat, he looks at his son Solomon. David didn't lose his dream. He was just going to pass it on. David won't experience it, but he knows his son will. And the last words that David will speak are coming up. And his words are measured. And he lays them out. And they're so rich with meaning. Here they are. 1 Chronicles 28, verse 8. And now, in this public place, all Israel looking on and God listening too, as God's people, I want you to obey and study every last one of the commandments of your God so that you can make the most of your living here in this good land and pass it on to your children. David now looks at Solomon and he says, and you, Solomon, my son, get to know well your father's God. Serve him with a whole heart and an eager mind. For God examines every heart, and he sees through every motive. I want you to look sharp. God has chosen you to build his holy house. After David was finished, he went over to Solomon and he presented to him the plans for the temple, the porch, the staterooms, the meeting rooms, the place of atoning sacrifice, all the furnishings, the Holy of Holies, the dividing curtain, the organizing of the priests and the Levites, the place where the Ark of the Covenant could stand. Solomon, here are your blueprints. I want you to be brave, and I want you to do it. David had it today, and it was an architectural drawing of something that he had received, and he now handed it to his son. That son was born of Bathsheba from the failure in his past, and he made it his today. The only building of its kind on earth, housing the presence of God Almighty. Solomon would fulfill David's today. Okay, now let's conclude with the forever. Here's a Super Bowl coach. He's talking to his young quarterback in the dressing room before he goes on the field. 1 Samuel 28, verse 20. David to Solomon. Solomon, take charge. Take heart. Don't be anxious or get discouraged. God, my God, is with you in this. And he won't walk off and have you standing in the lurch. He's at your side until every last detail is completed of the construction of the worship house. The priests and the Levites, they're standing ready. The craftsmen, they're ready to work. And all your leaders and people are ready. All I want from you is just say the word. So, Solomon begins. David's forever. Can't you see him standing there? He probably has his heart pounding in his throat. In front of him is that old battle-scarred father of his, 40 years reign, coming to an end. He hands him his scepter and his plans for God's temple. And he probably gives him a list of God's forevers as he passes them on to Solomon. Solomon, you've got a nation now, one flag, very united. Jerusalem is your capital. The military forces are respected all over from your enemies. Israel's boundaries are the largest they've ever been. Trade routes crisscross our nation. Prosperity has never been so enjoyed. God's righteousness can be heard throughout the land because of David. If ever a son had reason to be grateful to his father, it was Solomon. And David now, he concludes what he's been doing by falling on his knees, and he utters this prayer. Verse 10, 1 Chronicles 29. Blessed are you, God, God of Israel. To you, O God, belong the greatness and the might and the glory. Everything in heaven and everything on earth is yours. You hold strength and you hold power in the palm of your hand. And here we are, God, giving thanks to you, praising you for your splendid name. Talk about a forever. I just concluded my series on the life of David. He died in his ripe old age. But when a man dies, God doesn't die. And when a man dies, God's principles don't die. I think David taught all of us some wonderful lessons in spite of our failures and our humanity. Did you learn courage from David in the midst of your fear? Have you received forgiveness in your moments of sin? Have you learned the purpose of God even though you're drawing now and your dreams weren't fulfilled? Remember, God still loves you. And he'll always love you. And he'll love you through the Sauls in your life. And he'll love you through the Goliaths in your life. And he'll love you through the Jonathans who stand beside you in your life. And he'll love you through the Abigails who come to your rescue. And through the Nabals who scorn and reject you. through the Bathshebas when you were practicing infidelity, through your Absaloms who turn on you, and through the Joabs who are going to defend you, and finally through the Solomons to whom you're going to pass on your forever. Baron Rothschild was a Jew. He was born in Germany in 1744. He was a wealthy financier. He had 5 sons. He established a banking business. He had banks all over. He had them in London, he had them in Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples. The Rothschild family possessed the largest private fortune at that time in the world. Banks, real estate, mining companies, energy, agriculture, vineyards. Before Baron Rothschild died, he commissioned a portrait artist by the name of Ary Scheffer to paint his portrait. And although he was the wealthiest man on earth, he posed as a beggar, wearing rags and holding a tin cup. During one day in the painting of his portrait, a friend of the artist came in and he saw Rothschild as a beggar posing. Thinking that he was a beggar, he reached in his purse and he pulled out a valuable coin and he went over and he dropped it in Rothschild's cup. Sometime later, the man received a letter from Baron Rothschild. In it, he found a check from the bank worth $10,000. And the message said, "You one day gave a coin to Baron Rothschild in the studio of Ary Scheffer. He invested it, and today he sends you his reward." I hope David's portrait that the Bible has painted for you is going to be your reward too. Come on back next week. I've always enjoyed having you in Discovery class. Don't let me down. I'll watch for you then.